think we're all here as audience members are slowly entering the virtual room. So welcome everyone. My name is Christian van Veen and I'm the director of the Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Project. My project is based at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at New York University School of Law. And I want to offer a very warm welcome to everyone who has joined us today for a conversation on racism, digital technologies, and human rights. After months of pandemic protests against police brutality and systemic racism around the globe, and increasing calls for new technologies to resolve basically all of our problems, I believe the issues we are discussing today are higher on many agendas than they were at the beginning of what has turned out to be a horrible year so far. I also know that many of us are struggling with Zoom exhaustion and many other forms of exhaustion, but I hope everyone here will be energized by this discussion at least. And I say that because we have three amazing speakers here today with us that I would like to briefly introduce to you. First, we have Tendayi Achiume. She's the United Nations Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. And since that is a mouthful, I will also refer to her as the Special Rapporteur on racism, or since this is an informal conversation, Tendayi sometimes, if that is okay. She was appointed to this UN mandate in 2017, and she was the first woman to ever serve in that role since the mandate was first established in the 1990s. Tendayi is also a professor of law at UCLA School of Law in the United States. And yeah, she has many more accomplishments and affiliations, but there are too many to mention here on this call today. Our second speaker today is Nanjala Nyabola. She's a writer, a political analyst, and an activist based in Nairobi in Kenya. Her work focuses on African society and politics, technology, international law, and feminism. And in 2018, she published the book, Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, How the Internet Era is Transforming Politics in Kenya. And I read this a few months back, and I can highly recommend that to anyone who is interested in the issues at the intersection of politics and technology in Africa. This is what the book looks like and has a very cool cover on top of being brilliant on the inside. Among other impressive things to mention about Nanjala, she held a Rhodes Scholarship at the University of Oxford, and she also currently sits on the board of Amnesty International in Kenya. And last but definitely not least, we have Mutale Nkonde. She is an artificial intelligence policy analyst and researcher based in New York City. She's the CEO of AI for the People, also a non-resident fellow at the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford in the United States. She's also a member of the TikTok Content Moderation Advisory Board, and she is a key constituent of the 3C UN Roundtable for AI, which is also a mouthful. Mutale was part of the team that helped introduce the Algorithmic Accountability Act into the US House of Representatives in 2019. Now, I would also like to emphasize that we have an amazing audience here today. We cannot see or hear you because your cameras and your microphones are turned off in a Zoom webinar. But we have over 100 people here in the room, and since you cannot see each other, I can tell you the audience is composed of students, academics, but also human rights activists from global and local NGOs, representatives from tech firms, foundations, the UN itself, the media, and so on. And finally, I should mention, we are joined by my NYU colleagues, Lauren Stackbull, Victoria Edelman, and Adam Ray, who made this webinar possible in the first place. And I want to thank them for their tremendous hard work these last few weeks to make this happen at quite short notice. Thanks, guys. So the immediate reason we are gathered here today is because the Special Rapporteur on Racism presented a report to the UN Human Rights Council last week. And the focus of that report is on human rights violations that take place at the intersection of racial discrimination and emerging digital technologies. Tendayi will talk about the report in a minute, so I won't attempt to summarize it here, but just to say that one of the key findings of the report is, and I quote, emerging digital technologies exacerbate and compound existing inequities, many of which exist along racial, ethnic, and national origin grounds, which I think goes to the core of what the report is about. We are truly delighted that we can host this webinar about this very important and very timely report, and to have such brilliant speakers join us today. Not in the last place, because it very much resonates with the work that we are doing here at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice. I launched a project last year called the Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Project. And among other things, the project worked together with another UN Special Rapporteur, the one on extreme poverty and human rights, on a report to the UN General Assembly last October. And that report focused on the digitalization of the welfare state and its impact on human rights. And I think it's also relevant for our discussion today. And as Tendayi explains in her recent report to the Human Rights Council, there's a clear intersection between race and poverty where it comes to the impact of new technologies on human rights. And I quote again from her report: given that racially and ethnically marginalized communities often disproportionately live under conditions of poverty, equality and non-discrimination principles should be central to human rights analyses of emerging digital technologies for social welfare and other socioeconomic systems. And I couldn't agree more. And to give a very brief example of how race, poverty, and new technologies intersect, just wanted to mention briefly litigation in my home country of the Netherlands that our project was recently involved in, where a group of civil society organizations in the Netherlands challenged an algorithmic risk model used by the Dutch government to detect welfare fraud. That system was called System Risk Indication, or SIRI. And in an amicus brief prepared by the project together with my colleague at NYU, Philip Alston, we highlighted the impact of digital fraud detection systems on the right to social security, but also on the right to privacy of those who lived in the areas that the system targeted. And in February of this year, right before the COVID crisis hit, in a resounding victory for the litigants and in a landmark ruling that will resonate beyond the Netherlands, I think, the court shut the SIRI system down, which was great. And relevant for today's discussion, the court found that since, and I quote, SIRI has only been applied to so-called problem districts, and given the large amount of data that qualify for processing in SIRI, including special personal data, and the circumstance that risk profiles are used, there is in fact a risk that SIRI inadvertently creates links based on bias, such as lower socioeconomic status or an immigration background. So I think that case is directly relevant for the conversation we hope to have today in several ways. With our three wonderful speakers, what we hope to do is have a conversation structured around two main themes. So first, we want to highlight what we mean by techno-racism and why it is a highly relevant phenomenon. One of the things that we'll discuss as part of that discussion, I hope, is the fact that many of the discussions on technology and racism are to a significant degree US-centric. Yet the SIRI case that I just mentioned just shows that we're dealing with a global phenomenon, not a US problem. And what is more, perhaps because of this overwhelming US focus, we tend to forget that techno-racism does not merely happen in the private sector or in areas such as policing, but it's also a central concern in areas of our welfare state, social protection, healthcare, education. So that will be one theme. The other theme, given the fact that we are centering this conversation around Tendayi's report to the UN Human Rights Council, we want to talk about the relevance and also about the added value of the international human rights framework and global and regional human rights accountability mechanisms to debates about techno-racism. So I'll conclude there. Our plan for the next hour or so, we can go over a little bit, is as follows. We'll start with a conversation between our three speakers on the two main themes that I just mentioned. Now, during this conversation, members of the audience may use the Q&A function at the bottom of our screen to ask questions. And we will gather those questions. And after about 40, 45 minutes, I will basically redirect those questions, pose them to our three speakers. And given the number of participants on this call, I'm afraid we probably cannot answer all of your questions, but we hope as many as possible. And as I think was already mentioned at the start, I'm not sure, we'll be recording this conversation, and a recording will be available in a few days, accompanied by captioning. And since all the audience members have their cameras shut off and their microphones as well, we hope that it's not an issue for anyone. So I've talked enough. I'll hope to do not much more talking than that. Let's turn to our speakers. First question and theme is, what do we mean by techno-racism? Where is it taking place? Who is perpetrating it? Who is affected by it? Which parts of government and private sector are most affected? And crucially, why is it important to focus on these issues to begin with? And so I will ask Mutala to go first with the first response, then Anjala, and then Tendayi. And Mutala, looking forward to hearing your thoughts first, and would be great if you can also tell us a little bit about your recent research on facial recognition systems used in the housing sector in New York City. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the kind introduction, and I'm excited to be here. Congratulations, Tendayi, on what will be an exciting report for us, at least. So I came to this conversation purely by accident. It was 2012, and here in New York City, tech firms were beginning to migrate from the West Coast over to New York in what was called Silicon Alley. And that was also the year that Trayvon Martin, an African-American teenager, was stalked and then fatally shot by a neighbor. And I was obviously younger than I am now. It was 2012, but I had two small boys. And looking at them, I was very fearful about bringing up Black boys in a society where lynching was still taking place. And so when I heard about the children's coding movement, that was something that was very, very interesting to me. And through my journey as first a parent and then really a professional, I eventually ended up contracting with an NGO that we have here in the States that deals with children's coding. I came to work opposite the Google team, specifically their external affairs. And one of the questions that I had, really thinking about my own children and living in what's a racially hostile environment, were how do people get jobs? Because it became very clear to me that the people that I was meeting at Google tended to be white, tended to be male, tended to come from a small number of schools. And it just reminded me of the patronage system that we would have in Zambia. I come from a family that had significant patronage. So my uncles, my dad, these other people would get into these jobs and then they seem to have been passed on. But I thought at that time that that was a uniquely African phenomenon. And in the United States, they would have these advanced ways of selecting who got these prized positions. And that was really at the same time that Cathy O'Neil wrote Weapons of Math Destruction, which I consider to be a seminal tech in shaping my understanding on how algorithmic systems are built. And through that investigation and through what pre-COVID NYC looked like, where I live in Brooklyn, she lives in Brooklyn, we literally bumped into each other at a library. Through reading her book, but through also having this contact with her, learned that algorithmic systems were using what were being called statistical models to make determinations around risk or around probability of a task. But those statistical models were flawed within themselves. And that is really where I began to realize that algorithms and technical systems, machine learning systems, which we often call AI, also carry those themes. So to get back to the vertical of employment, again, thinking that I'm having this very local, how do my boys, who at the time were I think 5 or 6, but clearly ambitious parent, how do my boys gain access? And I realized that within the algorithms, they were using inputs like zip code data, which here in the United States denotes where you live. Where you live is determined by race. in this country to this day. And it was through a system that took force in 1934 and went through to the Fair Housing Act in 1965, where it was perfectly legal for the federal government to segregate Black people into districts and then not invest. And in that lack of investment, there then becomes a lack of educational opportunities. There then becomes poorer housing stock. There then becomes the inability for qualified Black homeowners to receive mortgages and therefore pass down wealth. And that is really where the intersection of poverty and Blackness specifically intersected, and these small, seemingly innocuous inputs would then become proxies for not just race, but for racial hostility and violence, something that I'm coming to call automated anti-Blackness. So even though I'm giving you in a small, my response is trying to be short because this is a rich conversation. It became abundantly clear to me that because it's cheap to use census tract data, this encoding of racism within algorithmic decision makings in the example I've just given, employment, actually comes from government-held data. So the algorithms themselves are only reflecting the norms and values of the societies that we're from. And in my case, it was the norms and values of an anti-Black society. And we're seeing that across verticals.
Thanks so much, Mutale. And just to say that you mentioned Kathy O'Neill, and just triggered a thought that a lot of the interesting books, I think, in the area of technology are being written by women.
Yeah.
So I have to think about, Virginia Eubanks, for instance, and
yep.
Those books seems to add something to previous work in this area in a way that many male books do not, which might be a coincidence, but maybe not.
I actually don't. I have a theory that it's not a coincidence, but I also want to point out that those books don't have a race analysis. And so what I found in my work is that it's women like Sophia Noble, who shaped my work, who's also at UCLA, and Nanjala, who's shaping my work and making me understand what the technical looks like in the African context. Even the report itself, it has been Black women who also say the sin of racism impacts us differently as not just people, but gendered people. And I'm extremely grateful to Ruha Benjamin is another person. I'm extremely grateful to have access to that work.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Nanjala, what are your first thoughts on the theme of what is techno-racism, why it's important for us to be talking about it, and if there is a chance, I know you've written about Huduma Namba digital ID system in Kenya before, which I think would also be interesting for our audience to hear about.
Sure. It's just really building on what Mutale said. For me, techno-racism is the disproportionate use of technology in order to consolidate or to lock in power disparities that are predicated on race. And when you use that definition, there's like two levels that you're thinking about. You're thinking about within one society, within one nation state. So you could think about the examples that we've heard about redlining and how redlining is combined with bank information in order to determine who gets a loan, who doesn't get a loan. And they tell you that it's automated, but it's actually not. But there's also a transnational element that I'm really interested in, and I've called it digital colonialism, because it's really using tech to entrench the power disparities between the countries that are building the technology and the countries that are buying it as consuming nations. And we saw this, for example, with the elections technology, elections technology. Many African countries now, Uganda announcing that it's going to do a scientific election. Namibia had a digital election. Kenya had its first fully digital election in 2017. And I write in great detail about the 2017 election in Kenya because I want people to understand that it's not just about building and buying software, but then that software, if it's not making things more equal, rather it's shifting that the French company that is protected by French law, that is protected by French political interests, then becomes a conduit through which the French government can exercise disproportionate power over political outcomes in Kenya, which is exactly how these things played out. So with that in mind, to me, when you want to find out, the source, the points of friction, what you want to pay attention to, first of all, is the intent behind the technology. What do people have in mind when they're building the software? And the Huduma number is an excellent example of this, because on paper, it was really supposed to be about the digitalization of identity systems in Kenya. But Kenya is a country, the modern state of Kenya, it's a post-colonial nation, whatever that post is doing in that description, it is a country whose judicial system, whose penal system, whose criminal justice system is a colonial one. Our penal code was passed in 1930, it's never been repealed. It's a country whereby the entire ethos of the state Kenya was not even colonized because it was in its and of itself attractive. It was as a conduit, as a market, as a producer of raw materials, as a conduit for Uganda so that Ugandan raw materials could be exported out of Africa. The whole logic behind statehood is infused with this racist intent of keeping, for example, the police between white property and Black people, and punishing Black people disproportionately for exactly the same crimes that the white settlers and their families would commit. So our ID system, the logic behind the Kipande system in the ID was about the criminalization of identity. When you digitize that, when you then say we want to make this system that has for the last 100 years been used to exclude, been used to punish, been used to criminalize, been used as a way of judging inclusion, exclusion. I mean, the ID system in Kenya is what we say is the marker between Kenya A and Kenya B, where Kenya A is the people who have access to privileges, the people who have access to, can walk in and out of whatever building, whatever part of the country and feel a sense of ownership. And Kenya B is the majority of the country that can be stopped, arrested, charged with the imaginary crimes just for being the wrong person at the wrong place at the wrong time. You have to examine the intent. So digitizing a system that was intended to discriminate will only make the discrimination more efficient. It won't make the discrimination go away. And these are the anxieties that we have with these digital ID systems. And we've already seen it happening in India with Aadhaar. We've already seen Dalit communities in India that have had this history of exclusion and being disproportionately affected by criminal law, by civil law, by all kinds of public law mechanisms, having that discrimination formalized, entrenched, and then anesthetized so that the people who in power can say, well, it's not us, it's the system that did it. It's not us that took 100,000 people off the social, what they call it, the food distributions, or it's not us who did it. It was the system that did it. It's the system that's broken. So that's one level, one place to look for these frictions. Another place is the assumptions that go into building the systems. I think that the report does an excellent job of interrogating some of these things. And the example that you've given about the Netherlands is really a startling example of this stuff, that the things that you can present as a technical, as a neutral factor are actually loaded with assumptions about how society works. And immigration law is an excellent example of this. If in an automated system, the Etsy system, whatever, a European person can apply for the same, a European person can apply for the same immigration clearance as a Mexican person and receive completely disproportionate treatment, because the assumption behind that is that a Mexican person is more likely to be a legal immigrant, and then a European person is, quote unquote, an investor. These assumptions exist across all societies. In Africa, we talk about the difference between an expat and an immigrant. You could have a Zimbabwean coming to start a business in Kenya is an immigrant, but a French person coming to start a business in Kenya is an expat. It's loaded within the immigration system. It's loaded within how people are treated, when they are applying for visas at the border. And now we take those assumptions and we formalize them. And we tell ourselves that they're somehow agnostic and neutral, but they're not. They're loaded with assumptions about who the people who build the technologies, how they assume the society works, and they formalize them and they consolidate them and they make the techno-racism possible. Yeah. And the final sort of place to look for these frictions for me and identifying techno-racism is the structures around the system. Who gets to build digital ID platforms? What do they get to use them for? who is the digital ID system supposed to impact the hardest? We talk about the digital welfare state. Well, the idea that poor people are constantly looking for ways to defraud the government is loaded with racist and other assumptions. The idea is that, you know, a company applying for a bailout from the state it's fine. You know, if we have to bail out billionaire businesses, then that's legitimate economics. But if we have to give $200 to poor people, you know, to help them get by, then we have to make sure that every single cent of that $200 is accounted for, and they're not using it to buy, you know, salmon, and they're not using it to buy handbags. Like, this paranoias about poor people defrauding the state reflect racist assumptions about who the state is for and what the state is supposed to do in people's lives. And so when we think about these frictions, these points of frictions, we start to see that actually there's a lot of this stuff going around. Think about migration law, you know, what's happening in the Mediterranean Sea. In Kenya alone, I can think about, you know, for example, the UNHCR and the refugee ID systems that are built around that, but also the Huduma number system. Also immigration law, you know, the difference between how Somalis are treated and the difference between how Ugandans are treated, even though Kenya has a longer border with Somalia than it does with Uganda. It's all these things are loaded with the human dimension. And that's why whenever I present my research, I always try to remind people, you cannot understand how technology is going to affect a society if you don't understand the society in question. There's no such thing as an agnostic system. There's no such thing as a neutral system. We have to prepare for impact. We have to brace for impact by first beginning with a deeper understanding of how that society works.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more for that call for context and understanding before you dive into sort of the more technocratic and technical matters. And just briefly, Nanjala, about what you said about the Netherlands and sort of underlying racist assumptions, when in Rotterdam, where that system was rolled out early on before the court case, when there was a victory locally because they shot Siri off in Rotterdam, there was a news item where there was a barbecue and there were a lot of people there who had a Moroccan and Turkish background. And so they were filming them celebrating the victory over this system. And there was sort of an underlying tone in that reporting of, look, the fraudsters have won. They're celebrating the fact that the system is turned off. It wasn't explicit, but it was definitely there. Tendayi, I want to get to you. Sorry.
I would say really quickly why when we're thinking about Blackness, it's who is Black in that society, not necessarily African.
Yes. Yeah.
Good point. Good point. It means much more than just African. It means the other, right? It means someone who's the minority, the less powerful. And just before we get to you, Tendayi, one quick follow-up from Mutale, and please keep it brief, but what Nanjala just said about sort of the history of Huduma Namba in the Kipande system and sort of how digital ID, but also before that, earlier forms of ID in Kenya have been used by colonial and other powers to keep certain people under. You say something in a recent article on housing and facial recognition in Brooklyn, where you make this comparison to a lantern law or something along those lines in New York City, way before we enter this era of artificial intelligence. And I think that's a very great point, sort of that we're building upon old systems of racism here.
Yeah, I'll be super quick. But yeah, that was the seminal work of Simone Brown in a book called Dark Matters. And she actually goes into the archives and finds that in the 18th century, in New York, if you were somebody racialized as Black, so in that case it was African, and you were out at night over the age of 14, you would have to hold a light up against your face so that you could be seen. And the idea was that these Black people are getting together to plot rebellion and overthrow white New York, when in reality, Black people and marginalized people have a history of wanting equity and wanting freedom, but there is not a large history of wanting to overthrow and then take on white supremacist norms and conventions. But I will step back because I could speak about that forever.
That's super relevant and interesting. Tendayi, I want to give you a chance to both respond to what Mutale and Tendayi have said. And I think one of the themes that has come up is there's nothing new under the sun in terms of systemic racism, but obviously there's something new added to the equation by the introduction of digital technologies. And also, could you talk a little bit more about what your recent report is about, and also a bit about just process. What is a UN Special Rapporteur, and what kind of impact, ideally, could a report that you write to the Human Rights Council have?
Right. Thank you so much, Christian, for convening us and for framing the conversation so well. And Nanjala and Mutale, honestly, it's a real pleasure to be on a panel with the both of you, because I think you've really laid out the issues in a way that makes my job even easier. And so I'll talk very, very briefly about what my role entails. Being a special rapporteur essentially means that you are an independent expert that reports to the Human Rights Council of the UN, which is the human rights body, the designated human rights body of the UN, and to the General Assembly of the UN, which you might think of as its parliament in some way, even though it doesn't have lawmaking powers. But it is the body in which every country in the world has a seat at the table. And to be an independent expert means I speak to the UN, but I don't speak for the UN. And this is always an important distinction that I like to remind people of. We are appointed and we're outside of the system, and we're supposed to be human rights experts who come in and raise attention, or, draw attention of the UN system to issues of very pressing concern, and then also shed light on how existing human rights principles either apply to the situation or need to be developed to tackle a problem. And so that's a little bit of a background. And there's many different special rapporteurs in different thematic areas. I focus, as you pointed out, on racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. So basically everything that is bad in the world. And in my work, I also take an intersectional approach to thinking about discrimination. And this is reflected in the report, which I'll talk about in a moment, which tries to draw attention to gender, disability status, class, sexual orientation, and how we think about the way that racial discrimination actually shapes people's lives. So you might think, after having heard Nanjala and Mutale speak, that the human rights conversation around racism and tech would be really sophisticated. And if you're somebody who's coming from the human rights world, you will know that at the international level, we actually have a really well-developed anti-racism human rights legal framework, right? So it's not like there isn't a legal framework that would apply in the space. And from what we've heard from Nanjala and Mutale, it's very clear that the problems of techno-racism, as they frame them, are not trivial, right? They are replicating discrimination and discriminatory structures in society, but they're also amplifying them, right? So yes, there's nothing new under the sun in that these systems are building on older systems, but they also introduce a kind of capacity and scope that means that we're actually seeing, a scale of discriminatory exclusion made possible by technology that, we might not have seen without these technological interventions. And the report goes into both of these things. Now, what motivated the report for my part was actually a very deep frustration. Every time I was involved in conversations on technology and human rights, whenever equality and non-discrimination principles were brought to bear, two things were happening. One, either they were an afterthought, right? So freedom of expression, privacy, all of these are all important sets of rights. I don't want to downplay the value of those rights, tended to be the leading ones. And actually, I really appreciated Philip Alston's report on the digital welfare state, which I think tried to bring, not tried to, but brought socioeconomic rights into the fore as well. But equality and non-discrimination tended to be an afterthought. And the most robust thinking around equality and non-discrimination was in the context of online hate speech. And online hate speech is a problem. Thinking about content moderation is something we have to really invest in. But there wasn't a really robust human rights conversation about how technology was reinforcing structural and systemic forms of racism, and how there was a legal framework that is designed to help us think about undoing structures of racism in kind of fairly robust ways. So the goal of the report was to disrupt some of the siloing and to say we have amazing knowledge being produced by people like Mutale, like Nanjala, like Sophia Noble, like Simone Brown, like, I could go on, right? There's amazing knowledge being produced about racism and technology. It is siloed from the human rights conversation, right? And it's also siloed from the kind of tech interventions that predominate at the UN as we kind of know it as it is. So it's not like the UN isn't taking tech seriously. I think there is a tech and human rights conversation, but in many spheres where that conversation is taking place, equality and non-discrimination norms, especially racial equality and non-discrimination norms, are fairly marginalized. So some of you may be familiar with the BTEC project, which is a kind of UN initiative that is thinking about technology companies and human rights principles. And even in that space, again, equality and non-discrimination norms were lagging. So the goal of this report was to say, we have a deep problem here, and we have a human rights framework that is supposed to be tailored to addressing some of these issues. So I'm in the mode of talking about the report, so I'm not going to go into all of the problems I have with the human rights frameworks and its limitations. We're going to have a second phase of the conversation that I think will go into that. But I do want to highlight now kind of the three things that the report seeks to do. So first, it highlights the political, economic, and social drivers of racially discriminatory tech use and design, and many of them have been touched upon by Nanjala and Tale. So really rejecting this idea that technology is neutral and saying that the presumption of tech neutrality actually does work to obscure and reinforce techno-racism in ways that requires confrontation, really highlighting that those who hold power in the design and use of tech are not groups that are racially or ethnically marginalized, or marginalized on the status of gender as well, highlighting how white and male the decision-making in this field is, even though it has global ramifications beyond Silicon Valley, all the way to Myanmar, to Zambia, to wherever you might be. And then also talking about the profit and incentive structures, and how even profit making is consistent with racial discrimination and intolerance. And so it's not enough to just go after kind of hardcore neo-Nazis as the problem, but we also have to be thinking about just profit making and the entire regime of how the businesses that are the most influential are kind of structured, and how they can make money and are profiting off of discrimination. And then on the side of states, how these technologies are adopted often in the language of trying to have fairer, more neutral systems. And in the process, what you get is discriminatory interventions that are adopted. So that's the first part of the report, is giving that background, which to me is a vital place to start for any kind of human rights analysis. And then the middle section of the report goes into providing examples of different forms of racial discrimination in use and design of race and tech. And the goal here was to highlight examples from all over the world, right? So in the context of the employment sector and digital employment systems, looking at how in places like Central and South America and North America and Europe, these systems are reifying racial and ethnic hierarchies and gendered hierarchies within labor markets. And so you mentioned earlier that sometimes the conversation can focus only on the US, and that would be a mistake, because these dynamics, as Nanjala was pointing out, are playing out within nations all over the world, and then also transnationally as well. And so thinking about those dynamics, and then really trying to make the point that it's not just about direct and intentional forms of discrimination, it's about disparate impact, right? And it's about structures of racialized exclusion that are sometimes explicit. So you might think about the situation of the Uyghurs in China, where there is a project of explicit ethnic, cleansing or genocide or marginalization that is made possible by a technological rollout that is truly terrifying. But then you also want to include in your analysis of kind of racially discriminatory structures like the one that was described in Kenya earlier, where you see that ethnic minorities that have been marginalized from identity systems in the past are also being excluded from access to public services as these structures are rolled out. And then also thinking about how, in the context of policing, in the context of healthcare, there's just so many examples that you have of racialized forms of exclusion. So that's the middle part of the report, and I'll talk about the final part before allowing us to move on. The final part of the report is really the human rights analysis. And in that section, which has the human rights analysis, I've titled it A Structural and Intersectional Human Rights Law Approach to Racial Discrimination in Design and Use of Emerging Digital Technologies. And this section draws on the work of other people who've worked in this area, but really trying to bring attention to UN member states that international human rights law provides for the foundations of the kind of approach that can help us in this space, right? And so even as we think about how we define the problem of what counts as prohibited racial discrimination in the use and design of tech, we can't be focusing on intentional bad apples. You know, the person who says, I am a racist who wants to use tech in a racist way. No, it's about disparate effects. So you could be the most well-intentioned individual or government, but if your adoption and use of tech is resulting in racialized, ethnicized, gendered forms of exclusion, that's prohibited under international law. And not only is it prohibited, you're required under international human rights law to be collecting disaggregated data that makes it possible for us to even assess what the impact of these technologies are. And in many parts of the world, there are rules in place, including in Europe, for example, where there's a ban on ethnically disaggregated data. And of course, all data collection can be dangerous if it's done incorrectly, but there can be safeguards that allow you to really track who is worst off in the use and design of this technology. And so the report makes the point that even just in terms of defining what we think the problem is, international human rights principles are essential, and they're not kind of optional, right? So in the tech world, there's a lot of talk of ethics and good practices. We have legally binding frameworks, which are not perfect, and law, of course, isn't going to save all days, all the time, or even some days, all of the time. But we have legally binding frameworks that apply in this space. In addition to the human rights principles and laws allowing us to be able to define the problem, they also very much place obligations on states to combat and prevent racial discrimination in the design and use of tech. And these prohibitions should be understood to include things like, in some cases, banning certain types of technology, right? If we can have no guarantees that they're not going to have discriminatory effects. And the report tries to give examples, you know, like San Francisco, which had the facial recognition ban after there were just very serious concerns in that space. And then also highlighting that under the international human rights framework, special measures or affirmative action are required by states to deal with racial discrimination, which in my analysis includes ensuring that racially and ethnically marginalized groups are included in decision-making at all levels, right, in the design and use of tech. So rather than saying you've produced the tech, you're using it, and then you want to check in with the groups who are impacted, they have to be involved in the processes from the very beginning. And, you know, we started from the point of acknowledging how undiverse, how white and male many of the spaces of decision-making are when you have critical race digital scholars who can contribute and shape these conversations. Part of remaking the decision-making is really taking race and gender and ethnicity into account. And then the final section of the legal analysis is saying that international human rights law also requires accountability here, and also reparations for violations that have existed, right? And so states have to be able to provide justice mechanisms and also reparations that include non-repetition, compensation, rehabilitation to the communities that are worst involved, that are worst impacted. The final comment I'll make is to say that, you know, in international human rights law, states are the bearers of obligation. And in this tech conversation, it is so clear that the tech companies in many cases are even more powerful than the governments, right? So we can't afford to think of the tech companies as just private actors, the way you might think of me as a private actor or anyone else as a private actor. They are almost super sovereign in some kind of way. And we have to take seriously the aspects of international human rights law that place obligations on states to hold technology companies accountable under binding legal frameworks. You know, it can't be that it's completely left to the tech companies to make decisions about how they design and use the tech when the profit motive is so consistent with discrimination. And so this is a very quick overview of the report, and I hope it entices people to get, you know, to actually read the report, which builds off of the insights of many different people who've been working in this space.
I can definitely recommend everyone to read the report and to go through it. There's a real richness to it in terms of the examples, but also the human rights analysis at the end. And we'll get to sort of the added value and the relevance of human rights in a moment. But before we get there, very briefly, I want to give Najala and Mutala the opportunity to respond to what Tendayi just said and just one comment or observation is in relation to Tendayi, your sort of expressed frustration with equality notions being an afterthought in a lot of these discussions on what we have conveniently called techno-racism, because it sounds good and it's easy to say. Sort of that frustration relates a bit to an interview I recently read with Ijeoma Oluo, the author of So You Want to Talk About Race. And I wrote it down. She said, a lot of people denigrate the value of talking about race and racism in technological spaces. And she links that then to the idea that many people apparently have an idea of tech as a neutral and equal opportunity space. So it's sort of inherently equal. And that seems relevant for the comment you just made, Tendayi, about sort of equality being an afterthought. So maybe you could sort of also give some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I can respond to that, first of all, from an advocacy point of view with the case in housing, but I'll predicate that with last year with colleagues here in New York, I published a report called Advancing Racial Literacy in Technology alongside Jesse Daniels, who is a sociology professor, and Darshan Mayer, who is a computer science professor at Bucknell here in the United States. And what we did was an ethnography of senior engineers working within tech firms and people who here in the States are called diversity and inclusion professionals. And we found two really interesting things. The first was that many diversity and inclusion professionals do not report to a C-suite level person, which means that idea is not prioritized within these companies. And then the second thing was that engineers in product teams were not comfortable with talking about race, and they would use euphemisms like diversity or others. That was the one that came up when discussing matters of what are very clearly anti-Black racism. And so in the findings for the report, one of the things that we said was we introduced this idea of colorblind racism, which has been advanced by Eduardo Bonilla Silva at Duke University. And what he says is when we do not name race, when we do not name race in the way that it shapes the outcomes of our lives, we rob ourselves of the opportunity of dismantling those systems that oppress us. And so what we were finding was in not naming race, there was this false racial innocence that these companies could hold when they're doing incredible harm. In the case of Myanmar, people are dying, right? There was another welfare state case that I was going to bring up from Chicago where children died, but because we've spoken about it so much, I'll go to housing. So when I was working with housing activists in Brownsville, one of the things that their call was very simple. These were not tech people, not tech scholars. They just wanted to maintain their privacy. However, when we were making a privacy argument, the same that is made in San Francisco and Somerville, which are majority white districts that sit next to research and development hubs for facial recognition and other biometrics, the idea that Black people were not human meant that from a strategic perspective, the racialized angle of the fact that this was a building where 100% of the people identify as Black, yet it was one of the first buildings in New York City where facial recognition technology was going to be replaced as keys, was one of the ways that we pushed through the noise. And there lies my frustration when I hear about human rights or when I hear about human rights organizations, because who is a human? Is that human only from the global north? And if they're only from the global north, if that human is racialized as Black, we are living in the same conditions as our brothers and sisters in the South, but somehow, because we are American or British, those unique concerns aren't heard. And then who do we then go to get recourse? So as a researcher, I know how to penetrate state and state systems. I was saying to Tendayi prior to us joining, and I hope we get into this later, how her report is actually going to assist me making a freedom of information request on techno-racism, which I would suggest isn't just a good and catchy title. It's absolutely accurate to what's going on the ground. right? It is, and it's something that I think should enter into the literature and into the way that we think about these systems. But the idea that Black people are not human unless we're in some type of border issue or some other extreme set of circumstances, there seems to be no way of thinking about racial discrimination in the ordinary. And I would suggest that being locked out of your home because a facial recognition unit cannot recognize your face because the capability isn't there, the technological capability, or that your pictures are sold to police forces, which is what's happening with Amazon Ring here in the US, where they take your picture and then they can sell it to a police force and that can be run again. You then become what folks at Georgetown Law call, you're put onto a perpetual lineup, which is unconstitutional. Warrantless search in this country is unconstitutional, but it's disproportionately impacting Black humans. So when do we get to access human rights?
Nanjala, would you like to briefly respond before we get to the second part of our conversation?
I don't think I have anything that I can add to that. I think it was really, I think it was really powerful, and I think it just captured, I guess the only thing I can do is sort of expand it to the transnational analysis, which is where we're seeing a lot of these things replicated. When talking about like migration and how tech is increasingly being used in migration governance and how it's disproportionately being used. You know, you look at the Windrush scandal, for example, and the rising use of conditional citizenship. And who are these conditional citizenship regimes being used against? And do we want to make these conditional citizen regimes more efficient by throwing technology at them, by the unseeingness of the state sort of consolidating that and hardening that and making it part and policy of the practice? Right now in Kenya, there's a big conversation happening about a couple of years ago, a number of Kenyan Somalis registered as refugees in order to access, because the refugee system was providing resources that the state was not providing. And because of that, the government has really just shut them out of universities, of hospitals, whatever, because of this hardening of this ID system that's happening alongside that. They're not considered Kenyan nationals. And there's a move, technology is a big part of this because of the way in which you know, when Mutale talked about the perpetual lineup, Somalis in Kenya are on a perpetual lineup, are constantly criminalized, constantly excluded at the drop of a hat. And so now having to apply for citizenship again, even because their parents, you know, made this decision that in their best interests at the time, having to struggle with these issues and having to say, well, why is if you have all my information and you know, why is this tech system being deployed against me? Why is my citizenship being made conditional based on a system that I didn't even know that I was opting in or out of? And I'm being locked out of the privileges of citizenship because of that. It's becoming an increasing problem. And I tie that to, again, political choices. In Zimbabwe, you know, when the Zimbabwean government that cannot provide salaries for doctors, salaries for teachers, salaries for staff workers, then spends money on building a CCTV surveillance system, facial ID recognition system with a partnership with the Chinese government. There's also the question of what priorities does the deification of technology, what does it displace? What is the government with, it says that it has limited resources and is trying to be more efficient. Even if we take that argument on its superficiality and say, okay, fine, and is disproportionately allocating resources to tech-based systems, what is not being done because we're spending money on tech? What is not being done is also a question that is underlying all of this. But I felt like the two previous speakers really captured the problem. You know, named the problem as it needs to be named.
Absolutely, and I like the fact that you sort of go into resources there at the end, because I'm in recent months doing a lot of work on social protection and digitalization. And one of the things that comes up there is that a lot of sort of social protection budgets are increasingly devoted to spending on technology, which is then sort of eating up the budget from actual, for instance, cash transfers. So that's a highly relevant point. I want to move us to the second part of the conversation, on human rights. It's already come up a number of times, and I think Mutale's sort of question just now, who is human, is of course directly related to the question, who has rights? And Tendayi just already talked a bit more about the report and what it seeks to do. And I think that brings us to sort of the relevance and the added value of the international human rights framework. Let me just say, I think there are at least 3 dimensions that are worth reflecting on in our conversation. First, why is it necessary to look at the implications of techno-racism from the perspective of international human rights norms? Because you also have civil rights norms, you have constitutional norms, you have ethical values that Tendayi already alluded to. And I recently read an interview with a public international lawyer, Nawi Ukabiala, and he said, for instance, the judicially invented intent to discriminate standard in American law makes it almost impossible to prove racial discrimination, and pointed out, for instance, that international human rights norms are much stricter on that point. Secondly, I think, what are the advantages and potential disadvantages of seizing global human rights accountability mechanisms as opposed to, for instance, domestic courts? So what's the sort of added value of special rapporteurs? The Human Rights Council is a question that comes up here. And finally, and that's a more of a critical question, is, are these global human rights norms and accountability mechanisms not themselves the bastions of white male privilege? And so what should change to the system itself to better address techno-racism? And Nanjala, if you don't mind, I want to go with Tendayi first, then Mutale, and then you as third. Is that fine? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Christian. And so I want to just quickly say something following on Nanjala's comments, which have brought up the situation of refugees, migrants, and other groups, people who aren't citizens of the countries where they are fairly, she's highlighted how tech impacts those groups, which is really important. And I just want to flag that this report that I presented to the Human Rights Council doesn't really deal with refugees, migrants, stateless people, and other categories of non-citizens, because my next report is going to do that. So my GA report is going to focus specifically on those groups and focus on racial discrimination and tech in border enforcement, because that's a zone where there's even fewer protections and where there is a lot of terrifying experimentation and intervention. But to get to your question, which I think is a really important one, I want to start out with 2 misgivings that I bring to my work as Special Rapporteur and to my work as a human rights advocate. Maybe I'll start with 3 misgivings, actually. One is that the history of the human rights framework and the history of the global framework, including the UN, is one that is very deeply implicated in the systemic projects of racial discrimination whose legacies we're still trying to work through. Here I'm talking about colonialism, transatlantic slavery. So we're not dealing with clean hands or institutions that were built for consolidating equality on a transnational or even within national level. The history of the UN is, and even of kind of the fight for anti-racism standards within the UN, is one that is fraught with those histories and those legacies. And so really just marking that genealogy is one that we have to grapple with. And then coming, a second thing that often troubles me is how, we talk about systemic racism, and I think the last few months have meant the phrase systemic racism is one that was even being repeated multiple times in the Human Rights Council in a way where I was like, what is happening when you're having states that typically are denying racism everywhere now even using the word systemic racism? But the truth is, when we confront systemic racism or when we name it, what we have to acknowledge is that institutions of power are not exempt from it, and in fact are usually the ground zero of systemic racism. Yeah. And you feel this within the UN, and you feel it even within the human rights movement, right? And when I say the human rights movement, I mean those organizations that have the greatest resources and the greatest prominence within the UN have marginalized issues of racial injustice and inequality, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, was part of why I was prompted to write this report, is that some of the leading human rights organizations will highlight human rights issues of different kinds. I think they've gotten better on gender and even sexual orientation grounds, but racism and ethnic discrimination, all of these, it tends to kind of be on the margins. And I've written about this, and that is as a challenge. And then the final thing I'll highlight is just the geopolitics of human rights, and the geopolitics of the enforcement of human rights means that powerful countries, even within the UN, get to shape priorities in human rights enforcement in ways that mean that if what you're concerned about is racial justice and racial inequality, you know, we saw this last month where the Human Rights Council had a debate on systemic racism focused on the US and law enforcement in other parts of the world. We had a almost very powerful resolution that came out, but the US, European countries, Australia basically put pressure in a way that meant we came out with a watered down resolution. So all of this, I think, could leave those who are invested in racial equality and non-discrimination norms feeling fairly disillusioned. Why even engage with the system? And I think Ntale puts a very, you know, she puts it very pointedly. Who is human when we talk about human rights? And oftentimes the answer is, it's not non-white people, and especially not Black people, right? That's oftentimes where that's going. Now, all of that said, you know, I think of myself as somebody who is invested both in a kind of a future that is fundamentally different from the one that we are in, right? And I want to think of human rights as having the potential for contributing to an abolitionist kind of approach. And by abolitionist, I just mean undoing structures of injustice in ways that remake institutions, right? So you see this now with calls to defund the police, which to me are about remaking institutions of providing safe communities in very fundamental ways. And I see the claims that are being made in those spaces as consonant with some of the kind of principles that we have in the human rights framework. So to me, what I'm interested in is, can we take the potential of the human rights framework and really use it to listen to those who are most subject to disempowerment in the current moment, and use their insights about what it might mean to remake systems that are unequal. And so one of the things I'm pushing for in the report is saying, again, ethnically, racially, gender marginalization, those communities that are excluded from conversations have to be part of how we understand the human rights framework. And if we can do that, we may move closer to transformation in ways, to me, that speak to we shouldn't entirely abandon the framework. Why not? We're dealing with a transnational problem, and we're dealing with a global problem. There is no national system, to me, that can take on the corporations, in part because they are trading on borders, and the fact that borders can make it very difficult to hold accountable actors that are, you know, operating across multiple borders. And states too, I think, are kind of engaging in a kind of arbitrage that means that they are using the transnational framework in ways that are advantageous to them. When we think about the mechanisms or the kind of frameworks or discourses that we have at a transnational level that have legal backing for pushing back against that, I see the human rights framework as one resource that we can't really afford to leave behind. And your comment, Christiane, I think really puts it concretely, right? When we're thinking about what's prohibited racial discrimination, many national systems have been able to narrow that. So we're looking for intent, right? And moving to the international tells us that disparate impact, it counts as prohibited racial discrimination. Now, is that going to solve all problems? Absolutely not. But can it get us closer to more humane conditions for people right now who are dehumanized? Absolutely. And that to me means we have to take those seriously. And so in some ways, I think the report is also a challenge to the human rights community to say, can you groups who are talking about tech and human rights also take racism seriously, right? And if they can't, then I think the problem is even bigger. And then we start asking questions about kind of who the system is for and all of those sorts of things. So that's a lot. As you can see, I kind of have, yeah, I think I could go on forever and ever about, but just some initial thoughts on kind of potentials and limitations.
I mean, there's so much here that we could talk about this for 10 hours probably and not get tired of it. Just a brief follow-up, Tendayi, about what you just said. I think I definitely relate to what you were saying about sort of issues of racism and also issues of what's happening in the Western world being ignored in international human rights institutions quite often. And sort of this idea of, I think a lot of diplomats and people working for governments probably had this idea, not just the US is pressuring us to help them, but also, is this really something the Human Rights Council should be discussing, right? That's definitely something underlying that debate. But to turn that into a positive, is there anything that came out of that Human Rights Council debate recently that makes you hopeful? For instance, the fact that in a global forum, the US was being discussed as being a prime violator of international human rights norms, or does disappointment still, is that still your overwhelming emotion about what happened there?
I mean, I have to say, it's like I've felt in that, as we were going through that experience, and for those of you who are attending the webinar and are not familiar with what happened, essentially following the national uprising against the murder of George Floyd and the kind of transnational Black Lives Matter protests that were taking place in different parts of the world, the Human Rights Council held an urgent debate on the situation in the US and in other parts of the world. And, you know, getting that urgent debate on the calendar of the Human Rights Council was stunning. I don't think anyone would have imagined that the US and other countries in the global north would be on the, you know, quote unquote hot seat in the Human Rights Council on issues to do with systemic racism rooted in white supremacy, right? It just seemed inconceivable that that could even happen. And it was made possible, I have to say, by an unprecedented uprising, right? What we were seeing around the world was unprecedented in many ways. And I think without people being out on the streets, we wouldn't have seen that. And then also mobilizations by human rights organizations and by the families of the victims of the killings themselves. So the family of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, many of them put it before the Human Rights Council. And then the African delegation within the Human Rights Council requested that the president of the Human Rights Council hold the debate. And the way the terms of that debate began were truly amazing. And it was as though the Human Rights Council was listening to, you know, groups that were calling for, you know, defunding the police. And actually, you know, there were even in statements made in that Human Rights Council along the lines, Black Lives Matter, right? Like that phrase alone being said in the Human Rights Council was completely stunning. At the same time, what truly, truly horrified me was that some of the ways in which strong interventions that could have come out of that debate, you know, one of the proposals was an international commission of inquiry. Let's actually have an international body that would hold the US accountable, was to see countries from the global north, so European, Australian, all of these, basically saying the US is a democracy that we trust. You know, they can deal with this domestically. Also, is this really as serious a problem, right? So basically, if it isn't genocide in Myanmar or some other part of the global south, right? And if the government that is responsible for the violations is one that they view as a liberal democracy, it seemed as though there was no capacity for the international system taking seriously the violations of a liberal democracy against racial and ethnic minorities. That essentially the message they were saying is that if you're a Black person, if you think the international system is going to save you, you better be in a state that has been branded as one that is kind of defunct. But if you're in the US, you're out of luck. And I've said this before, there's Makau Matua is a scholar whose work is really powerful. He has this article called Savages, Saviors, and Victims, in which he basically says one of the problems with the human rights regime is that the savages are basically countries from the global south, right? So countries we don't think of as established liberal democracies, and those are the ones that remain within the sight of human rights advocates, the human rights system, as violators. And then the saviors are the countries in the global north, which can never be grappled with for their violations. So again, I think here the challenge is to break through some of those ways of thinking about who violates rights and who doesn't. And we're in a moment of seeing kind of what the possibilities are. Sorry, Christian, you probably wanted a brief answer, but
no, but it was a fascinating answer, so I didn't want to interrupt you. We have about 20 minutes left, and I also want to get to some of the questions that the audience asked. So Mutala and then Nanjala, I want to ask you to keep it at 2 minutes, and then I will be very rude and interrupt you at that point. I'm very sorry, but we'll get a chance to respond to the questions. And for both of you, one of the interesting things I think that come up here is, Mutala, you talked about who is human. That's a very important question. And that makes me want to ask, beyond just the formal UN human rights mechanisms, what is the sort of emancipatory, liberating potential of using the language of human rights? Just invoking, I have rights because I'm a human. So if you could respond to that in your answer as well, would be great.
Okay, so very quickly, because I want to get to answers as well. I don't know that, so AI for the People, which is my organization, actually uses culture and art and literature to put forward these arguments, because we don't have trust in our governments. And Tendayi beautifully kind of articulated that if you are a Black person in the global North, you can still live in a country where your government will send in troops to a city with no presidents that shoot at white citizens, which if this happened in a nation state in the South would be an international emergency. And so we only have the streets. So one of the things that even immediately reading the report, I could see how AI for the People could make sure that this gets into writers' rooms in Hollywood and other places of media production, into books, into journalism, because we feel that if there is such a thirst for people, ordinary people marching in the streets to liberate themselves from so many different forms of racial bias, that this is the moment. And I will very quickly include that includes white people. And what I see happened at the Human Rights Council wasn't just Australia, the EU, and America placing pressure. It was the political force of white supremacy as a power system engaging across borders to make sure that the norms of whiteness and racial capitalism are held in place and deployed through the tech industry.
Thanks so much, Nanjala.
I'm going to speak to the question of why the human rights framework, why even bother using the human rights framework? And I can think of three overarching reasons. One is that it gives us certain pathways for demanding accountability, because the human rights framework is probably the oldest and the most used, even if it's not always the best used arm of international law. So you're thinking about going all the way back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so people have, and even before that, even before the UN system, people have these ideas of how, okay, a human wrong has been committed, and these are the pathways that we can use in order to address that. And it could be legal, it could be domestic law, it could be international law, it could be through conventions, it could be through, it gives us a way to start thinking about redress. It gives us a way to start thinking about how do we fix this. The other thing is also that it established a transnationality in the conversation, so that it no longer becomes a problem for St. Louis or Portland or Paris or whatever, but it becomes an international discourse. It becomes something that can be articulated and translated into different, not just actual languages, but cognitive frameworks. And so the human rights language allows people in, for us, for example, for the Amnesty in Kenya, to be able to take the language of what's happening with George Floyd and start to think about police brutality in Kenya and start to unpack what's happening in Kenya, and hopefully start to build a global movement for accountability. But thirdly, it also allows us to establish genealogies. And one of my, I think what Tendayi has described that happened in the last Human Rights Council is really interesting, because I think 3 or 4 years ago, there was this We Charge Genocide conversation, whereby, in fact, it was led by teenagers. I think the spokesperson was 16 years old, out of Chicago, who looked at police brutality in Chicago and started to document and went to the Human Rights Council to say, well, actually what's happening amounts to the same threshold that you've used, for example, for the Rwandan genocide, for what's happening in Bosnia, and this is what we charge with what's happening with police brutality and genocide. We Charge Genocide actually has its roots in a 1945 document that was put forward by Du Bois and Claudia Jones and other leaders of the racial justice movement, civil rights movement in the United States. So you start to see a historical thread that says, actually, this thing wasn't fixed 50 years ago. Wasn't fixed 60 years ago. It's worse than it has ever been. And therefore, we need to actually keep paying attention to it. It allows us to start to archive all of these wrongs and injustices as part of a broader genealogy of discrimination. And then we start to see a pattern. As legal practitioners, that, as Tendayi was saying, intent can be very hard to prove, but disparate impact, once you establish a pattern, can be much easier to prove and much easier to argue against. And that's what these genealogies can do for us. So I think there is definitely value in using the human rights language in the human rights framework, I think going in it with eyes wide open, but it might not necessarily fix everything. And as you said, the system itself also has issues. Going in it with that eyes wide open can have a tremendous impact on the conversation.
Thanks, Nanjala. That's really one of the most convincing answers I've ever heard to the question of what is the added value of human rights. We should definitely sort of capture that in some way. We have 15 more minutes, and I just want to get to questions. And I think maybe the best way to go about it is for me to read 3 questions that were asked, and for you to just respond to any element of those questions that you think are relevant from your perspective. And I'll give you each 5 minutes to sort of respond and make your closing remarks. First is by Jesse B, and also an anonymous participant. They say governments are not likely to give up using automated decision-making systems in the area of social services or criminal justice. That said, what are your recommendations for how to set up a framework when developing a new technology? And to ensure that it's applied equitably and justly. And a related question by Badria is, how can countries in the global south, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, best ensure human rights considerations are incorporated into tech design? So those 2 questions are about incorporating rights in design, assuming that this is the way of the future, using digital technologies. Then again, Anonymous asked, can you share some thoughts on the technological responses to COVID-19 around the world? It seems that in many places, particularly in developing countries, the crisis is used to rapidly introduce new modes of surveillance and oppression. So perhaps talk a bit to that. And finally, Ines Ferreira asks, in many cases, the discrimination potentiated by technology is covert. For example, it may stem from targeted advertising in digital platforms that is not evident to the discriminated user. How to ensure that the perpetrators are held to account and that the victims get reparations for those violations. Mutal, I'm going to go with you first, then Nanjala, and then I'll end with Tendayi, and you each have about 5 minutes.
Okay, so I don't remember all the questions, but one of the things I'm personally looking into right now is the use of technology around COVID. And there seems to be a lot of conversation about COVID trackers and the surveillance possibility there. But what I'm going to kind of turn my response over to is the way medical equipment assigned. So there was a study with researchers at NYU and researchers at Wuhan in China, and they were looking to develop an AI-based system. And when we talk AI, what we're talking about are machine learning systems that are fed training data of historic decisions to predict future decisions. And in this particular case, they were looking at COVID mortality rates and using this system to decide who to assign a ventilator to at a point where a hospital is at capacity. Now, I'm extremely concerned about this because health data, it becomes encoded with racist understandings and messaging because health is so linked to income status, to poverty, and to life experiences generally. There are many studies in the United States and across the world that speak to the weathering effect, and that is when people that are negatively racialized within their communities age faster and become their immune systems become weaker because they have to navigate not just the huge racism that they face, but the day-to-day shutting of people shutting doors, people not inviting you to meetings, people telling you to change your hair, your lips are big, whatever. What seems to be very small, but has a cumulative impact on the body. Therefore, one of the things that we saw in COVID were these high infection and mobility rates amongst people that are racialized as Black in the global North. So whether you're looking at a data set that's from the United States, the United Kingdom, or other white majority countries where they have a Black population, Black being excluded and not necessarily African, the patterns were the same. Therefore, what's going to happen with this AI system? What are we training this AI system to do? We are training this AI system to deem that Black life is not viable. And that cannot be understated, because in a moment where we're advocating for Black Lives Matter, we're also building technologies in the name of public health, using public funds to then deem that at the point of death or close to death, Black lives don't matter, and the ventilators will not go there. So that's one very pointed example. There is a Chinese-US collaboration, and the fact that they're not thinking, the fact that this is a colorblind approach. So going back to what I said earlier, if you're not naming racism and thinking about racism, or not reading reports like Tendai's, or books like Njala, the work I'm outputting, then you're not necessarily thinking about that. What I think is happening is, in the minds of the developers, they just want to find the most efficient, and efficiency within the tech context often means has racist outcomes. And this is going back to Nanjala's last point and to Tendai's previous point. This is where the disparate impact framing becomes really, really important, because you can develop an intervention, you could develop a legal intervention based on Black people are dying from COVID at higher rates. These are the underlying issues. The underlying issue is systemic racism. Yeah. Therefore, we can think about some type of amicus brief, or we can think about some type of class action, or whatever. You can think about a legal strategy. I'm a communicator, so I'm also thinking about the communication strategy or point on top of that, and then thinking about how do we apply pressure so that our norms around technology change. And that links to the first answer. I think I'm running out of time around governments are going to use these technologies anyway. I would suggest that no, they're not. We still have rights. Still have the ability to push back. And within defund the police, one of the things that we were able to do in the United States was to argue within the Justice of Policing Act that facial recognition not be used for the purpose of policing because of these same issues. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Nanjala. Nanjala.
I'm going to focus on, again, building on that issue of governments are going to use this tech anyway. I just don't think so. Nothing Inevitable. Everything is a product of human action and human agency. People talk about, for example, the police, and they say, well, we need the police, we need the police. And I always point out, the Kenyan police was founded in 1920. Does that mean that we didn't have, any kind of social order before 1920? Does that mean that there was no society? No, of course there was. It's just that we have certain assumptions about institutions, and then we confer upon them a sense of permanence that doesn't necessarily even reflect how permanent that they are. And so everything has to stay on the table. We can't always assume that because we're here that everything has now become inevitable and we have to just live within this framework. No. Everything has to be on the table, including abolition, including completely moving away from the systems and moving towards when nobody believed, when San Francisco banned facial recognition in public spaces, nobody believed that San Francisco, of all the towns in the world, would actually ban that. But they did, because they did all of this work that we're trying to urge other countries, other towns, other cities to do, which is to interrogate how these things will impact public life in the short term, long term, medium term. And that's what we really want to do. Technological responses to COVID-19. It's really interesting. There's been a bit of a lag phase, I think, in Africa, because people first of all, didn't believe that the virus would get here, and then it did, and it got here last. And now we're sort of starting to see a lot of countries. South Africa has hit its surge, but now other African countries are about to enter the surge period. And I think what has happened is that there's been a delayed reaction. So we haven't had anything that we can actually say, well, this is happening, and we have to pay attention to it. But I will say that in Kenya, for example, the government has put together a tech commission on COVID-19, a commission specifically to deal with tech and COVID-19 that's supposed to build on monitoring and surveillance technology that already exists. And so the pre-existing concerns about who builds Kenya's surveillance technology, I would recommend this amazing report that was done by Privacy International on surveillance in Kenya. It's called Track, Capture, Kill. The Kenyan surveillance architecture is not only designed to punish and to exclude minorities, but it's also extractive. because it's supposed to create data that can be processed offshore by companies, Huawei specifically in China. And so it's something that I'm paying attention to and looking out for examples of. But at the moment, I think everybody is still looking at the public health emergency and sort of adapting to this world that the public health emergency has created. And so thankfully, the tech concerns are still a little bit on the back burner at this point.
Thanks so much. And I think the nothing is inevitable could well be sort of the slogan for today's discussion, because I think that implies hope, that implies that we can sort of push back, and that this is not sort of written in the stars. Tendayi, it's to you to make your final remarks and to close us off. So you have 5 minutes.
Oh, right. And I think I can actually do it in a lot less than that. On COVID and tech, you know, I think our baseline assumption should be that the technologies that are being rolled out are going to have a discriminatory impact. And this is kind of what the report is about, because of the way the tech is made, the assumptions that go into it, and all of the, you know, things we have been talking about here. So it is not a kind of alarmist or conspiracy theorist analysis to say that the baseline assumption should be that we're going to see a discriminatory impact. In fact, I would say that's the science, right? So, and this is something that I highlight in the report as well. But I also want to highlight something else we should be thinking about when we're thinking about tech and COVID. If we're thinking about who's able to sustain their livelihood, who's able to be on this webinar, who's able to continue educating their children at home and doing all of those things, all of that is based on how connected you are, right? How technologically set up your home is. And we know that that occurs on class lines, on racial and ethnic lines. And the report highlights that in North America, indigenous communities, for example, are very much excluded from internet access. And so when we think about who is thriving right now and who can maintain a semblance of normalcy, that too is impacted by techno-racism. So it's not just the government responses, but even it's just the baselines that people are able to maintain. It's really important to think about that. In terms of affecting change, you know, I want to remind people who are on this call that change takes place at a multi-scalar level, right? It's going to be national, it's going to be local, it's going to be global. And I encourage people to be engaging in activities that are devoted to shifting power. And I think we're in a moment where in different parts of the world, communities are being forced to think about racial and ethnic exclusion that is systemic in the way that their societies are organized. This conversation around tech cannot be divorced from that conversation generally about how our societies are structured. So I might say to you, you know, if you're worried about governments aren't going to do X, vote, you know, be invested in putting into office governments that will take seriously the concerns of their people. We need awareness. And I think that's the power of the conversations we're having now, is just, if we can mainstream the concept of techno-racism, that already, I think, shifts the kind of presumptions around tech neutrality that make it so hard to do anything. And so worlds are being kind of made and remade all of the time. We see too much power to those actors who are invested in the status quo. And I think it's about listening to voices that are helping us think differently. I want to, you know, to all of the people who are on this call, and maybe we could share on our list to everybody afterwards, lists of scholars who are thinking creatively about what it would mean to undo the structures of systemic racism that we've been talking about. If you're not reading Mtale's work or Nanjala's work or the work of many other people who've been thinking long and hard about this, then you can't really say you're taking the problem seriously. So there's learning to be done by everybody, and there are resources already that I think point the way to what that might look like. My report included, I don't want to not highlight the fact that people also need to read my report, which is supposed to be trying to kind of contribute from a human rights perspective to, and it has concrete, you know, suggestions for what actors might do. I guess it just remains for me to thank all of you for this really insightful conversation, which I think has dealt with lots of complex and difficult ideas. And I appreciate your time, Nanjala, and Tade. Something tells me you are living on webinars such as these in this moment, which is exhausting personally for yourselves as well, and you're implicated in these issues as well. So I want to especially thank you for contributing your time to this one as well. And thank you, Christian, for doing this, and also for being willing to connect this conversation to the really important work that you all are doing with the digital welfare stage, which I think has broken open a way of thinking about systemic forms of exclusion in the human rights space that is also so important.
That's great to hear. Thank you so much, and thanks to you three and our audience for an amazing discussion and amazing questions at the end. And I'll definitely follow up on that idea of having a list to share. I hope to take 2 weeks off in August, and one of the things on my to read list should be the literature on that share list, and we'll definitely share the report and the book and the article that Mutala has recently published on Brownsville and facial recognition. And also just to say finally that we were joined by about 150 people, but also exactly keep in mind what Tendayi just said, that people are not able to join. And that's not a theoretical issue, that's a super practical issue. I've been in too many webinars recently where internet connection for some people is just spotty, they drop out, and they're sort of literally digitally excluded from the conversation. And we need to think a bit better about how to have real inclusion in these conversations as well. It's more about just sending out invitations to the right people. It's also about making sure that everyone can actually join. We're gonna share a survey with the audience afterwards, and I hope you can all fill it out. And just to say, this is not the end of the conversation, just the beginning, and hope we can sort of in some way have another conversation before too long. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Tendayi. This was excellent.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye.